So a very warm welcome everyone to our beautiful reading room. And since we're still in January and it is the first EPRS event of the year, Happy New Year everyone. We are privileged to have with us today the President of the European Parliament, Roberta Metsola, and the Vice President of the European Commission, responsible for values and transparency, Věra, Jourová, introducing the book, A Death in Malta, an Assassination and a Family Quest for Justice. Today's discussion is set in the wider context of the protection of journalists in the European Union, an objective on which the EU institutions have adopted major legislation during this parliamentary term. The book will be presented by its author, Paul Caruana Galizia. Paul will be in conversation with two members of the European Parliament, Ramona Strugariu and Assista Kanko. And the conversation will be moderated by Juliette Garside. Juliette has been Deputy Business Editor in The Guardian since 2021, and before that was a member of the investigation teams. So you are all very welcome in the European Parliament for this book talk. The book is already available in the collection of the European Parliament's library and is, of course, available in the best book in town. We're not allowed to sell the book in this room, but if you have your own exemplary, it can be signed by Paul, I'm sure, after this. So, after the panel conversation, there will be an opportunity for questions from the floor, but please bear in mind that we have only 1.5 hours available. So I wish you an excellent discussion around the book, and I invite Juliette to lead the panel now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So today, first of all, I think we're going to hear from President Jourová, who'll say a few words. President Metsola and Vice President Jourová. And then I will introduce the panel fully, and Paul will present his book. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the European Parliament. I'm delighted to have you all here today, and thank you, Etienne, Anders, the European Parliament's Research Service, for organising it. Thank you to Paul Caruana Galizia, his brothers and family for being here, to Vice President Věra Jourová for performing miracles with her agenda to speak today, and to Ramona and to Assita, members of the European Parliament, who have stood loudly with us over the last years. To Juliette Garside, who shone a light that keeps shining, thank you for being here. We are here to discuss Paul's devastatingly well-written book. And it is not without a sense of pride that we welcome a newly published author from Malta, whose debut work has received such accolades from across the globe. The book, A Death in Malta, an Assassination and a Family's Quest for Justice. This, to me, is less about death than it is about the life of Daphne, Paul's mother. Reading it through took me to a plethora of emotions. I laughed, I cried, I clenched my fists and waved them in frustration and disbelief at the empty room I was reading in. I nodded along at Paul's descriptions of the beautiful Malta I know so well, the dark corruption and murder that plagued our journey, and his perspective of the events that in no small way shaped my country, my career, and my outlook. And still, the reality is that the whole world knew Daphne Caruana Galizia, the investigative journalist, but far fewer knew Daphne Caruana Galizia, the woman, the sister, the mother. The pain she went through, the impact of the state-led dehumanization campaign against her, the hate she faced, the violence and the threats, the misogyny, the isolation she was forced to endure, and the sacrifices she went through to protect her 3 boys from the onslaught she stood up to face down every day. The conversations that I had with Daphne fluctuated between politics food. She edited a mouth-watering magazine too, and stories about her boys, about Matthew, the computer wizard who was in South America following in her journalism footsteps, about Andrew, the diplomat who spent some time at this European Parliament, about Paul pursuing life in London and how he stood up to the Malta Labour Party's cameras. I will explain more about that later. More than anything, she was so proud of her 3 boys, of the men you have all become. We often describe her as fearless. I don't think that is accurate. She did fear. She did worry. She did get anxious at what they did to her. But she kept going because she knew that if she didn't do it, nobody else would. That is as much a testament to her character and sense of purpose as it is a damning criticism of all of us, who, despite our efforts, simply did not do enough. We rested on the certainty of her column or of her blog to make the arguments, even the uncomfortable ones, the difficult ones. It is hard to describe the influence that her column in different Maltese newspapers had. Daphne shaped public opinion. She wrote under her own name, a woman unheard of at the time, and held her own. She was a force of nature the country struggled to understand. She held a mirror to our society, and sometimes we did not always like what we saw. Paul describes an anecdote how early on, about 30 years ago, she described our Prime Minister and the then leader of my political national party, who brought Malta in from the cold, as little more than a village lawyer, a statement so benign that no one here would bat an eyelid, but that sent a tidal wave through a society that simply didn't comment that way about our elevated politicians. It still makes me smile at how much angst it must have caused. Times have changed. It is something that characterized her writing. In his book, Paul describes how at ease Daphne was in London, where every other columnist wrote freely, controversially and openly, and nobody minded. No one put their faces on billboards. No one slit the throats of their pet dogs. No one tried to burn down their houses while they slept. No baying mob chased them down the street. No one went after their children. In Malta, Daphne was unique in more ways than one. Paul describes his Holy Communion ceremony, a sort of rite of passage for young Catholic children, and how he was sent in flip-flops instead of the more traditional white tuxedo. It is a hilarious passage in the book, but it showed that Daphne went against the grain, even on things that have long been unquestionably accepted. And that meant she had to be brave. She should not have had to be brave. That should not have been a characteristic of journalists exposing corruption and organized crime. Because brave and defiant she was, and she really was. What is difficult to explain, and that the book does so well, is the level of systemic, state-led intimidation that she was exposed to. The scapegoating, the online abuse, the branding of her as the witch by the corrupt cabal she exposed. The dozens of frivolous lawsuits that were filed against her by ministers and their donors, by shadow banks and passport salesmen. The attacks by racists, the websites that were created directly and only to intimidate her. It was utterly outrageous in a democratic society, in an EU member state, in my beautiful country. They did everything to silence her, including targeting her children, whether it was Matthew, who they went after for every tiny indiscretion, Andrew, who they removed within hours from his diplomatic posting, or Paul, whose face was on loop on their TV stations for weeks, years even. That looped video was my first memory, if you can call it that, of Paul. With his mother at the University of Malta during a party leaders' debate, where the Labour Party had a camera entirely fixed on them instead of the leaders, until a young Paul, in no uncertain terms, told the cameraman where he should go. A reaction that would be funny if the circumstances were not so tragic. I laughed at the description in the book of Paul's father, Peter's reaction, where he asked his son whether that was the extent of his vocabulary. A reaction Peter would repeat when an older, wiser Paul would use again equally colourful language when years later he was again caught on camera, this time as one of the journalists trapped in our Prime Minister's office as he was resigning over the public outcry at the corruption Daphne exposed before her assassination. The 16th of October 2017 is a day that will remain with me forever. They murdered a journalist for writing what was entirely normal anywhere else. They changed the country forever. They shook our European Union. And that is why the commitment, the responsibility that we have is as personal as institutional. When a government minister froze Daphne's bank accounts a few months before her murder, I remember sitting in our Libe committee meeting with David Casa as we raised the issue, and what a chilling effect this would have, sometimes even to incredulous looks from other MEPs. That is why we started the campaign for an EU anti-slap law that we call here Daphne's Law, and that is why I'm so proud we got there in the end. The European Parliament will continue to stand on the side of truth seekers, on the side of justice, of independent journalism, on the side of everyone in Malta. We have demanded answers, we have scrutinized, we have legislated. We launched the Daphne Caruana Galizia Prize for Journalism, and we will continue to legislate to ensure that our Europe is a space where journalists are able to work free from fear, from harassment, from violence, from murder. The Media Freedom Act and the Anti-Slaps Directive will allow journalists to do their work without having to fear financial or emotional ruin, or even worse, for their lives. We need to do more to protect journalists in Europe and beyond. In Gaza, we have witnessed too many journalists killed. Our voice needs to be louder. Journalists must be able to do their job. 75 months since her last post, I still catch myself either logging onto Daphne's blog or unconsciously asking what she would think about the decisions we have to take. I miss her. I miss her writing. I miss her humor. I miss her recipes and her cooking tips. I miss the standards she asked from the political class. I know so many do too. And I only take comfort in the fact that her voice continues to live on in her family, in her colleagues who are still targeted and harassed, but like Daphne refused to give in this house, who remembers her. Paul writes that the book is about his mother before she is lost again. With you three as children, she will never be. Thank you.
Thank you for that vivid and passionate introduction and for setting the scene. And now we have Vice President Jourová, who was in Malta in 2018 as part of the Commission overseeing events there and has been involved since the beginning.
Indeed, I was in Malta in 2018. I remember there were headlines before I came in Maltese press: uncomfortable visitor is coming. I don't know why I was so uncomfortable, but there were some issues in the country. And it was one of my strongest moments in my life when I met in the cemetery some of you and also your grandparents. And I suddenly heard myself promising things. We will do more to guarantee safety for journalists. Daphne will work with us, and she was working with us, because we put together several initiatives which were inspired by the fate of Daphne and her family. And it's a never-ending call on us, politicians, that we have to do more. I heard from the Ministers of Justice, how can we introduce such legislation to give the privileges to some at the court proceedings? There has to be guaranteed access to justice for everyone, even if he or she is rich and powerful. And we said, yes, it has to be guaranteed, but also we have to do a lot against the abusive litigations, which you know very well how it works, how many of those Daphne had on her shoulders, and which you took over after her assassination. So I gave promises in Malta at the cemetery, and Daphne worked with us. The anti-SLAPP legislation is not the only thing we did. We only could introduce rules to enable the judges to stop the proceedings when they have cross-border scope or cross-border vector. But I now plan in the remaining time of my mandate to go to the member states and ask whether they can introduce such rules also for domestic cases, because cross-border is a minority of cases. I wonder what the answers will be. I hope they will tell me yes, once we open the proceedings, we will also add the domestic cases. The same will be happening when it comes to safety of journalists, because the Commission issued a recommendation to the Member States to take practical measures to increase security and safety of journalists. Journalists has to be able to work without fear, to do their job, because we need them to do the job in the time of increase of disinformation and different bad sentiments gaining ground again, bad sentiments and bad actions which we saw in the previous century. We need journalists to do their job, to protect our democracy, how we want this democracy to keep, because democracy is under the threat. So again, I will ask the Ministers of Home Affairs, what have you done and what will you do to protect journalists better? Roberta, you mentioned journalists working in the battlefield. In Gaza, the journalists are dying. In Ukraine, they are sacrificing themselves for the ideal that the people get the facts right and that they get access to true information. I also want to mention the Media Freedom Act. Finally, we have it under the roof, I hope. It was not easy. Again, not many believed at the beginning that European Union will have the first ever Media Freedom Act, because I heard so many times that there are 27 media markets. It's not true. We need to have high standards for the work of media and for the work of journalists. We need the law to be able to react when things go very wrong in some member state. So, all what we have done as the Commission, together with the Parliament, together with the member states willing to see the need of the era, we did new things. Now we will have to work further on to see these initiatives to be fully implemented, to be taken seriously, and to improve the situation and safety situation, especially of the journalists. Also, we heard from the President that Daphne had to face a lot of hatred and misogyny. We are planning for the beginning of March an event focused on the situation of women in the public space. It will be about politicians, about the journalists, about the human rights defenders, the women who have courage to speak up, to go out with her opinions, and who are harvesting incredible intensity of aggression and hatred. If we continue like that, the women will not be willing to undertake these risks. That's why we are inviting women, politicians, journalists, human rights defenders, who, some of them have given up. They were fed up of it. And some of them continue to do the work. And we want those who continue to give more courage to other women to continue and to be willing to undertake the risk. We also invite men to have a word, because it's a job for both women and men to make the public space healthier and more inspirative and more functional than what we see now. I had a lot of fantastic phrases in my speech, but I decided rather to inform you about what have been done and what is being planned. But at the end, I have to say, I very much admire the family of Daphne, your courage, your determination to keep your mother's name in the public attention, because, as I said, as such, she can continue what she was doing when she was with us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Vice President, for the work that you have done already for journalism and the work that you continue to do. And I know, the UK has left Europe, but as an editor on a newspaper in London, your work is having ripple effects there as well. The UK is passing its own anti-SLAPP legislation, and in fact that legislation will deal with domestic cases. And the first time I heard the word SLAPP was actually from Matthew, who's here in the room with us today, Daphne's eldest son. And really this started with them and with the fight that they took on. So we're going to have a discussion today about media freedom, protecting journalists, and President Metsola will join us, and also on the panel we'll have Ramona Strugarin. She's a Romanian MEP, joined the Parliament in 2019. She's on the Justice Committee, and she's also passionate about press freedom and has done a lot of work to get the SLAPP legislation as far as it has come already, and she'll be talking to us more about that, and to get the European Media Freedom Act through the Parliament, which concluded in December. And we have Asita Kanko, I hope, who is also an MEP since 2019 for Belgium, and a member of the Justice Committee and the Foreign Affairs Committees. And she cites the journalist Norbert Zongo, who was assassinated for his work in 1998 in Burkina Faso, as a big political motivation for her. But first of all, we are going to hear from Paul Caruana Galizia about his book. Like his mother, Paul is a journalist, and like her, he is redoubtable. He works and lives in London with his wife and young son, and he's already held a number of very powerful people to account: a newspaper proprietor, a hedge fund manager. He's won the Orwell Prize, a very prestigious journalism prize in the UK, and he's been recognised at the British Journalism Awards. And just a few words on his book. So A Death in Malta was published last year. It's in fact, I think, many books in one. It's above all a loving portrait of an exceptional woman, but it begins as a history of Malta. It's also a political thriller. It's a detective story. It tells the events, the dark forces that gradually closed in against Daphne, and then the long, hard fight that followed, in which her three sons and her aunt, her sister Cora, their aunt, who everybody's here today, took on the state of Malta. And it's about the allies and friends that they made along the way, some of whom are here today, President Metsola and Vice President Jourová, not least among them. Democracy, rule of law, free speech, these are the things that Daphne stood for and defended in her work, and that mission's been taken up by her sons. They are passionate, they're articulate, and they've galvanized, I think, a generation of people to take responsibility for guarding those values within Europe. And I guess in that sense, for me anyway, the arc of Daphne's life is still curving through time to the present. And Paul's book is a point on that curve, an important one. So without further ado, please tell us about A Death in Malta. Whatever you feel most comfortable with.
Okay, let's I don't really know grammar enough for podiums or speeches, but we'll give it a go. So I am, first of all, really touched that so many of you have come here 6 years on from my mother's murder. And I'm really touched also that this event has been organized so well, and to be here with people who've played such a crucial role in our campaign. So Juliette Garside is the first journalist we spoke to after my mother's death, and would go on to write one of the most important stories that followed up on her investigative work. And of course, President Metsola and Vice President Jourová have been really consistent and quite powerful campaigners for justice in my mother's case. The European Parliament is actually the place of our very first campaigning trip. It was just over a week from my mother's murder that my brothers and I came here to speak to really anyone who would listen to us. And of course, you know, none of us are lobbyists or politicians, although Andrew worked here a long time ago. And we had little idea of what we should do, what we should say. But people did receive us and listen to us. And I remember telling them one particular thing. So if you remember at the time, Hungary and Poland's rule of law crisis was really acute. And one thing we said is, if you can't get a handle on the European Union's smallest member state, then what hope do you have of managing Hungary and Poland? And we said that, of course, to provoke some reaction, and it did. Shortly after that visit, the Parliament sent a delegation of MEPs to Malta and reported back with really serious concerns about the country's rule of law. It passed a resolution declaring that there is a real rule of law crisis in the country. And that kind of set the tone of our campaign that, as Juliette said, is still going. The book marks a point in the arc that hasn't yet set. So I wrote the book in part to tell the story of that campaign because I felt it's an important one to tell in its own right, but it would help recover some of my mother from all the current reporting that we're seeing. So one that paints her primarily as a murder victim rather than a person who was so full of life. And I felt that quite strongly, that her murder was becoming bigger than her life. And her life, I realized only when writing the book, was a very European story. So the the politician, or the political leader President Metsola mentioned, who brought Malta in from the cold, did that in the late 80s, shortly after Andrew was born. And before that moment, which was Malta's end of history moment, the country had lived through a very left-wing form of governance, very restrictive, few products on shelves, little attachment to the West. And my mother grew quite disaffected by that environment, and through reading foreign publications developed an idea of what life could be like if it weren't for that government, and saw in Europe the promise of all that, of freedom, of wealth, of opulence, of free markets, of liberal democracy. And her description of that man as a village lawyer, as it happens, he used that nickname for a chapter in his autobiography, which I quite liked, was because of this frustration that he doesn't want it enough. He's not what we need. The country needs wholesale root and branch reform. It needs to become a member of the European Union. It needs serious governance. And starting in the late 80s, early 90s, it looked like that was the path we were on. And she was very for it, of course, and wrote about the benefits of membership and what it was bringing. In the end, or in retrospect, the country got a lot of the economic reform without much or enough of the institutional reform. And that worked, and it worked until it really didn't, until in 2013, the country elected what now most people recognize as a populist government with an especially populist leader, Joseph Muscat. And it's funny to think now that this was 2013 and, 3 years before those big populist landmarks of Brexit and Trump and what happens when you get those kinds of politicians. And Malta was there telling us what would happen. You get that government, corruption grows and grows and grows until the country is in a full-blown rule of law crisis, and it's almost impossible to wrestle it back. And that's why we came here, again, little over a week since her murder, because it was obvious to us then that Maltese institutions were so totally compromised that justice had to come from outside. And one trip led to another, and, we've lost count, my brothers and I, of how many trips we've made here to Strasbourg, to the Council of Europe as well. Really all over the world, looking for people who would speak to us. And in the end, it had a real effect, right? And that thing we told MEPs, that Malta is the smallest member state, so, use it as a case. It worked because we are very sensitive to international pressure, and that pressure generated enough space, enough attention on the country, so that campaigners there, non-corrupt members of the judiciary, of the police force, could act in the space they needed to properly act. And we have seen some progress. So 3 hitmen have pleaded guilty now. A middleman has confessed to his role. The man who's charged with commissioning the murder is awaiting a trial for the murder. But all of my mother's investigative work, so on corruption across most of Malta's public sector, remains as it was then. So there hasn't been a single prosecution over any one of her major corruption allegations to this day. As part of our campaign, we also had Malta's first ever public inquiry. It's a real moment in our, post-independence history. That inquiry reported 2 years ago and made a great number of recommendations to improve the country's governance, and not a single one of those recommendations has been implemented to this day. So, as Juliette said, we are still on that arc and hopefully moving to some resolution. And that's why the attention this Parliament has put on the country is so important. And I hope the book, if you read it, you see my vocabulary has improved since that time, and that you'll enjoy it. And you see what it takes to wrestle a country back from that kind of situation. And above all, that you will meet my mother, not as a murder victim, not as a symbol of journalism under threat, but as the person she really was, so full of life, so full of her own convictions, and just a wonderful person who happened to be our mother. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Paul. That was beautifully put, and wonderful to hear from you the reasons why you decided to tell the story for yourself, which was a journey of discovery as well, and quite an investigation of its own, and has thrown up all sorts of new perspectives on multiple rule of law failures. So we're going to open the discussion. I'll kick off by asking a few questions, and at some point we're going to invite Ramona and Asita onto the stage to join us. But first of all, I just wanted to read a short passage from your book, in which you describe the moment when Jürgen Fenech, who's the businessman who has been charged with commissioning Daphne's assassination, was in court for the first time. And you describe, you say, as the details emerged in open court, people again told her she was a martyr. And they gave us an old idiom. I can say this in Maltese because my accent's not great. Oil always rises to the water's surface, meaning justice is inevitable. They said it to be kind and to give us hope, so I just said yes, of course. Then I thought about what my brothers and I had been through, we're still going through, about how close Fenech was to getting away, and I told myself we're only at the beginning. It wasn't a given, was it, that oil would rise to the surface? And did you know that from the very beginning?
No, it wasn't. It wasn't a given at all. And in fact, initially, in the first few weeks, things felt so hopeless that it's exactly that drove us on, this kind of feeling that, what else are we going to do? Who else is going to do anything? And it really, there were a series of lucky accidents that led us all the way to Fenech. And of course, the decision quite early on to share a lot of my mother's material with you and your colleagues, right? So you did that story about a big privatization project Jürgen Fenech profited enormously from at the country's expense. That was the first major story, a few months after the murder. And then a few months after that, the revelation that Fenech was the owner of a shell company my mother had been looking to uncover, so 17 Black. That was this kind of final piece in the corruption puzzle she had been working on. And, to think that it took a team of journalists around the world, police officers in Malta, officers from Europol, all the pressure that this Parliament generated and that the Council of Europe generated, it's in fact hard to think of a lever we didn't pull on. So it took everything. It took every available measure to get us here.
Absolutely. Roberta, I wanted to ask you, at the time, can you take us back to 2017 and what was happening in Europe at the time? This beginning of the rise, we just had Brexit, beginning of the rise of populism, attacks on the judiciary, on media, not just in Malta, actually, at the time. You know, tell us a bit about why this story reverberated well beyond Malta.
So first of all, I can remember clearly where, and in fact a lot of my colleagues can say the same, where we were in this house when we heard. I was in the terrorism committee, and I remember thinking that, look, in a way, at the irony of us being here legislating somewhere very far away, talking a lot about countries outside the European Union and not looking at what's happening in our own country. But that also meant that a lot of us, and I see a lot of members here, I see Sophie now here, is that I knew, and I remember getting together with David immediately in Casa, saying, how do we make sure that this is a cause that is taken up by this Parliament? That was at a time when any legislative coming together, identifying loopholes, to a certain extent completely ignoring what was happening in member states by Brussels, was very, very far away. But the work that Paul and his brothers did was really keep us focused in order for us to make sure that there was a majority, a constant majority inside this house, to make sure that we look at what we could do as a legislative institution. I wouldn't say that my immediate reaction was, would this link to Brexit and Trump? At the time, I looked at my country and I say, my God, this is what happened. How are we going to recover from it? And if you ask me whether we have or ever we will from that day, I don't think I can say yes. What we then had is that a few months later, 4 months later, is that Jan Kuciak and his fiancée were assassinated in Slovakia. So that then galvanized the Maltese and Slovak members of the European Parliament into saying this is happening inside the European Union. And then what we did is we started to meet with international organizations of journalists and started to say, look, how can we fix this from a legislative point of view? Vera worked a lot there. And there were really moments when we thought we would not manage. Perhaps last point is that what have we done so far? It has been a very difficult mandate. We have managed to arrive from a legislative perspective. But what hurts me the most is that we still find ourselves in debates in our own country on Daphne. That we are still, that same arguments that were brought up with regards to her. Remember, this was a systemic campaign. In other words, there are people who have never met her, have never met these boys, who think they know things, and they use it and they repeat it. And my fear is that their children will repeat it too. And we still find ourselves in that situation. In a country where there would be, and here I really need to pay tribute to groups of civil society that emerged, were created the day after Daphne was, or on the day Daphne was assassinated, that would be stopped every day by a government, only for them to find that the next day they have the courage to continue again, from holding or putting up a memorial in her name for years. Yes, they would put it up in the morning, every evening it would be taken down. Put it up in the morning, every evening would be taken down. I remember thinking, don't they get tired of taking it down? Not of putting it up. But that's a reality. And that I could not believe in a member state. And it then culminated in the last few days of 2019 when LIBE, so the committee that we all work in, organized a mission to Slovakia and Malta back to back. We first went to Bratislava, Sophie was there, and then we went to Malta. And we knew that there was the tipping point that we had been waiting for. I wouldn't have believed it a few days before, but we said, this is coming. This is coming. And then it happened. And Have the institutional reforms happened? Have the structures changed? The frustration that the family has been through with the judicial process is huge. And we did not do enough then, before Daphne's assassination, and I think we're still not doing enough today.
Well, I acknowledge that the reporting and the political spotlight that you shone, I think, gave strength to people within Malta who wanted this situation to end and to stand up for rule of law, to push for that. And for example, the public inquiry happened as a result. I know you are going to leave us shortly, and I'd love to put one question to you if you have time. And it was about you personally, Vice President. What brought you to Malta? Why were you galvanized by this?
Yeah, well, I went there to ask carefully the investigating judge where they are with justice, because I knew that we all were waiting for the fair verdict, for the efficient investigation which will catch not only those who did it but also the masterminds. And why carefully? Because of course I was Justice Commissioner, but it didn't give me any right to interfere into the independent investigation. But there was also a question mark how independent the investigation can be when Daphne was disclosing the cases of the high-profile politicians. Yeah, so that's why it was a very careful discussion. I had several dialogues there, but I wanted to show that also the Commission and myself that we are waiting impatiently to see the murderers, the perpetrators being punished. And it took too long. Then in the inquiry played a very important role, and so justice is always slow, but it has to come. And I also want to say that the reaction of the murder of Daphne and Jan Kuciak was not only the laws relating to the world of journalism, but the journalists like Daphne and Jan, who were murdered because they were so capable. Incapable journalists would not be killed, sorry. Or those who are paid from public budgets. Sorry, there are such journalists as well. But they were so capable because I speak Slovak language. I also could read a lot of details on how Jan Kuciak worked with the public information sources. It was amazing. I am sure that Daphne had also very well done and functional method. And what these cases and the work of journalists also, what pushed us to do were at least 4 things. First of all, to pay attention to the situation of media in our member states. Here comes the rule of law report, which we always come with in July. There is a very objective description of the situation of media in each country. And it's for strong reason in the rule of law report, because the situation of media belongs to the rule of law principle. The second thing was the start of functioning of the European Prosecutor's Office. Protection of EU money is at stake here, yeah? And that's why I also want to mention it here. It was not, of course, direct reaction on Daphne's assassination, but the atmosphere was here that the money has to be better protected, and many journalists were writing stories about the abuse of EU money. Anti-money laundering legislation. We made it very strong also on the basis of some cases from Malta. And last but not least is the anti-corruption package, which is still in the process. I would like to say shamefully slow, because we need to be much better in fighting against corruption in the European Union. And I have to repeat it, without the work of journalists like Daphne or Jan Kuciak, believe me, for the politicians, if there would not be such a strong call to take action also in these fields.
Thank you. And golden passports, another one, which I think a particular interest of yours. Thank you both. So interesting to hear from you. Thank you. So I'd like to invite Ramona and Asita to come and join us here. And to members of the audience, if you'd like to ask a question, please raise your hand and we will come to you with a microphone. Yes, this lady over here at the back. I think over there in the far corner.
Thank you very much for the very emotional seminar now. My name is Stella Veliki. I have studied physics and informatics, and I am a member of the European Physical Society. I have a question. I appreciate very much the fight of Mr. Galizia to bring justice for the assassination of his mother. I appreciated this. I have a question to him. I would like to know your opinion concerning the work of now the journalists. They are analyzed corruption and organized criminality in your country, Malta, after the death of your mother. There are better conditions for them to do some research, or is no changes?
So is it safer now for journalists in Malta?
I want to know.
Yes,
Okay.
please.
So all of the conditions that existed around the time my mother was murdered are largely still there. So the public inquiry that was mentioned earlier, most of its recommendations were to make Malta's media environment safer. None of those recommendations have been implemented, for example. And one thing my brothers and I have said consistently in our campaigning is that the single best way to protect journalists who are reporting on corruption and organized crime is to act, or for the authorities of that country to pick up their reporting. So the situation in Malta was one where the authorities didn't. So it was my mother against really hideously corrupt government officials and organized crime groups.
Any other questions? And can I ask you, before you put your question, to introduce yourself and say who it's for? Any questions? I'll come back to you in a moment. I'll put one. Oh, yes, hello, sorry. Down the middle at the back.
Hi, Alex Jacobson. My question is for Paul. Well, it's a bit more of a word of warning. I come from the generation of Maltese youth who grew up just with the European Union, being in the European Union. I have never seen a generation of people so apathetic to the situation in their country at the moment. And as Malta falls and continues to tumble down the press freedom index every year, being 83rd, one of the worst in the European Union last year, down 5 points from the year before, it is a fairly common saying amongst my generation that Malta's finished and there's no need to stay there anymore. So how do we encourage people of my generation, youth, to really get into journalism, to fight for values and so on that they care about? Because I genuinely worry that at this point we're seeing more and more leave, and there might not be anyone left then to pick up the dust, you know. Thank you.
That's quite a gloomy picture there, but
a good soul-searching question, and I feel a bit of the hypocrite because I left Malta in 2009. But on the other hand, a lot of the campaigning, or all of the campaigning I've done from outside the country, because this is an event about the book. It was through writing the book that I actually developed or really fell in love with the country again, which does have an amazing history and has overcome some really extraordinary obstacles to even become a country. And I don't know what the answer is, but I guess, you know, it takes one person and then another to stop a kind of wave of apathy completely taking over. And I hope in the example of this campaign, we are doing a bit of that.
And your brother Matthew's actually returned to Malta, hasn't he?
Yes, I should have said. I should have said. So Matthew runs the Daphne Foundation, which is based in Malta. The proceeds from the book, by the way, completely go to the foundation. And its work is to a large extent about making those kinds of changes. So changing the culture around Malta's rule of law, its governance, and so on, and working with as broad a coalition as possible.
Can I just butt in here and put a question to Asita? You mentioned to me how you had been influenced by your own story of tragedy in Burkina Faso, the assassination of Norbert Zongo, who was an incredible journalist in his day in the 1990s. Can you tell us a bit about that and the thread that connects that story to what happened in Malta for you?
Thank you. First, I would like to thank you, Paul, for writing this beautiful book. I knew the story because I worked on it in Libya. We went together with Roberta and Sophie to Malta. And by reading this book, you see the newness of the perspective you used to tell it. It's showing love for your mother, showing love for freedom, showing love for journalism, and actually a cry for hope. And you speak about your country too, about Malta. I really recommend everyone to read it. I couldn't wait for the paper version, so I started reading it on the Kindle. Regarding the murder of Norbert Zongo in Burkina Faso, there are so many similarities. He was also investigating corruption. He was, to me, my mentor. He was like a second father for me. And I was a teenager who discovered journalism and the importance of journalism in society through his eyes. He was calling his newspaper The Independent. And he was not only claiming to be independent, he was really independent. Not only as a journalist, but also as someone who thinks freely and who wanted to show everyone that we could do that and that we had to do that, because without a free press, you cannot have a sustainable democracy. So as a teenager, I was 16 years old when I met Norbert Zongo for the first time. I basically took the bus and went to the capital city, 100 kilometers away, and that is a lot of kilometers if you go from one small city in Burkina Faso to the capital city. And I wanted to meet him because I wanted him to explain one thing to me. It was one sentence on his newspaper that was, the sentence was, the freedom to think. And I couldn't get it. I used to think all kinds of things that nobody knew. And I thought, what does he mean? And why does he call himself the independent? And why is he saying that this is linked to the responsibility to inform? And he was speaking about the corruption. So I went to him and I asked him to explain things to me, and he did. And that's how we connected and became friends. And he was killed when he was 49. That was 2 years later. And it really changed my generation's perspective on free press and what our responsibility is. And one day on December 13, 1998, we all came back from school, and then we heard that Norbert Zongo that he died. They didn't say that he was killed. And then they said it was an accident. They started to lie about the fact that he died. How can you die in an accident when there were bullets in his body, and he was in his car, and his body was burned in his car, and the car did not explode. And they said it was an accident because he was carrying gasoline. All kind of strange stories. We never actually, we went out in the streets for justice. And it was basically the reason why I even became a politician. So went out for justice. We never actually got justice. Usually in these situations, we never really get justice. It's only the people who executed the crime that eventually went to jail. But all the corrupt people who permitted such a crime against a journalist and against democracy to occur, they continue what they're doing. So I think the best thing that we did, and that you are also doing for Daphne, that we did for Norbert Zongo, was to continue to fight for what he was fighting for. To understand that, you know, that he didn't die for nothing, and that we had to change the situation for a new generation of journalists and of citizens to emerge. That's basically what it taught me. So when I went to Malta and when I saw what happened here, I really didn't expect something like that to happen in Europe. I was born in West Africa. I came from a dictatorship where there is even no freedom, and this is a European Union country. I was like, how is that possible that something like that can happen here for the same reasons? And we need to convince people to realize that this is bad. So we need to continue working every day, and I'm glad we are joining forces on that.
Thank you. Yes, how could it happen in an EU country? That was the feeling that everyone had at the time. Yeah, I remember it. Ramona, you've been working very hard to get two big pieces of legislation through the Parliament. We've made reference to them here today, but I just wonder, because there are people tuning in online as well who may not be so familiar with the programme. Could you tell us briefly what SLAP stands for, and at what point it's at, and what you've achieved also through the European Media Freedom Act?
Yes, I would love to, with maybe, if you allow me, a few introductory sentences. Because I've been responsible from the Libe Committee on the anti-SLAP legislation, and we worked at the own initiative report of the Parliament before, and then I also was the Libe rapporteur for EMFA, the European Media Freedom Act, and now I'm the rapporteur of the Parliament for the Anti-Corruption Directive. And I've also been the Renew Europe rapporteur for the entire anti-money laundering package that we just closed. And they're all connected to each other. And, I haven't met Daphne, but there's a striking similarity between her and her sons. The look in their eyes. There's something there that tells everybody that they are simply unstoppable. And that's, that's something that nobody can beat. You can kill a journalist, but they can never, ever kill their story. Each and every one of us wakes up in the morning to look for information and news that comes from media, right? First and foremost. There's tremendous power in there. Almost all of the convictions, investigations that ever happened within the European Union and outside the European Union were due to an investigative journalist or a network of investigative journalists. Revealing what? Corruption cases, money laundering cases, inappropriate behavior coming from politicians and all kinds of giants coming from the corporate world, meaning that all of those persons and networks of power became the enemies of journalists because they are the ones making these revelations. Do you know what was one of the most difficult topics to discuss in the anti-money laundering package that we closed now? Access for journalists and civil society to the beneficial ownership registers. I wonder why. I just wonder why. Yes, because there's very powerful information that these people are putting together so that we live in a better world, a safer world, actually, not for politicians and criminal networks, but for citizens. Magistrates have protection, and they're supposed to operate fully independently when doing their investigations. Politicians enjoy immunity for their, statements and activities. Journalists have nothing. And it's amazing, speaking about why do journalists have to die? And I think the commissioner was mentioning it earlier. I think because of that power that they have to bring truth to light, and because there are a lot of politicians and other people who consider them truly dangerous for their interests. And I remember that back in the previous mandate, when I was working in the European Parliament in my technical capacity, and we were discussing the Whistleblowers Directive. Back then, and I worked together with my MEP to some amendments willing to include journalists and the protection of journalists in the Whistleblowers Directive. In front of the room, the statements were very generous coming from politicians. Yes, we are willing to defend whistleblowers and free press and so on. And then inside, in the technical and political discussions, to the proposal that we should include journalists, the answer was, why? This is their job. If they die, they die. This is something that they are dealing with, and it is their problem to deal with. And the legislation now, the anti-SLAPP legislation, because SLAPPs are basically trials meant to intimidate journalists and activists and destroy their lives, asking for tremendous amount of money. And I think all of the Caruana Galizia brothers know exactly. They have how many now? 50. 47, yes. And they know exactly what it means as a tool of intimidation, but this is something that I think hundreds of journalists and activists have been, if not thousands of them, have been confronted with in the European Union and in the world. So we needed something, at least a small step, because by the way, the cross-border dimension covers about 11% of the SLAPPs, and the big chunk is in each and every member state, and this is what we need to tackle. That's the next step. But at least something to create a practice and send the message that it is not okay to sue journalists and activists and to intimidate them and to harass them and to destroy their lives. A minimum protection. I wouldn't call it a great victory. Like, I do not call the European Media Freedom Act a great victory. I call it recognition for a work which is fundamental for defending democracy, rule of law, and the whole framework, the justice framework, that, anti-corruption and so on. With EMFA we did the same thing, but it's a much broader framework there, because it tackles editorial independence. The best thing that politicians can do for journalists is to stay away from them. Don't go there to, buy influence, to step on editorial decisions, to try to influence this decision in any way, because journalists are not my journalists or their journalists. They're independent people doing their job. And if you like what they write about you, great. If you don't like it, well, that's a pity. But it shouldn't prevent them from doing their job. Then, publicity and rules for that, the relationship with the platforms. Article 4, the famous Article 4 on interference, spyware, the national security issue that was so controversial, and we have no mention whatsoever to national security in the European Media Freedom Act, and this is something that we really fought hard for, and that was one piece of resistance coming from member states.
Expand on that a bit more. So you wanted protection so journalists couldn't be prosecuted for breaching national security?
Journalists cannot. So there are two things there. First of all, journalists cannot be, so they're fully protected, they cannot be investigated or detained or harassed or in any way for their journalistic work, period. This is absolute protection. Then, if we are talking about an investigation for a serious crime, I don't know, drug trafficking, whatever, serious suspicions and an investigation concerning a serious crime, then the set of procedural safeguards that journalists benefit from, particularly because they are journalists in the exercise of their profession, is very solid. So the whole framework is stronger than for regular people, let's say, because we are trying to protect them from abusive behavior, abusive investigation, all kinds of, wiretapping, spyware, so on and so forth, because these were problems that we've seen in the European Union, still in the European Union. And do not ask me how this was a topic for debate, negotiation, and conversation with the member states. We don't have the time. I mean, we're probably 3 days from this moment on. I could tell you about it, but in the end, we made it. And I think it is a huge step forward for the protection of journalists. Whether you can do more and better, yes, you can always do more and better. But 4 years ago, 5 years ago, we wouldn't have dreamed to be here. The idea itself to have an anti-SLAPP directive and a European media freedom regulation was something that, when we were discussing about it, I heard voices, quite important voices, saying that we're delusional. It will never happen. It's not possible, it's not fair, and yet we are here today. But we should continue this form of recognition without selling big victories and using really, big words, because it's the minimum that we can do.
Recognition. A recognition of the problem is the start of dealing with it. Any more questions? Yes, this gentleman in the centre row. Sorry, I'm keeping our mic man on his toes by springing him. It does.
Mark Dempsey from Article 19. Paul, we haven't met. I joined Article 19 about 9 months, so really that was a wonderful and touching speech, and hello to all the extended family and sorry for your loss. I worked closely on the EMFA and the Anti-SLAPPs Directive, and I think there needs to be an element of, how would you say, a sort of truth brought into the discussion. I mean, they're good as introductory pieces of legislation, but there's a long, long way to go. And Ms. Jourová, I think there has to be also, when it comes to looking at the EMFA, again, journalists aren't fully protected. I mean, and this is, it's crucial that this is acknowledged, that Article 4 leaves it at the discretion of the member states. What is positive is that it's a regulation, so it's directly applicable. And now the question is, how is it going to be enforced? But at the same time, we can't kid ourselves that journalists are fully protected across the EU. SLAPPs are up in Ireland, Italy, France, in many different states. So there's a lot of work to be done. And I don't have a question to end this quasi-rant, but I think it's important that there's a degree of realism brought into this discussion. And again, I congratulate the family for their bravery and courage and their campaigning over the last couple of years.
Thank you. Behind you, I think there was another hand raised in the back.
Hi, my name is Milan. I'm a Maltese citizen living here in Brussels. My question is for Paul, and I learned this from your touching speech, that none of the corruption scandals your mother had uncovered have been investigated. Is that correct? And what are your hopes, if not expectations, for the future? Do you see any possibility of any of these coming to potential law courts or no?
So for example, the kind of the really central story on all her reporting, based on the Panama Papers. We've known that the former Prime Minister's Chief of Staff and the former Energy Minister have had these, or set up these shell companies in 2013, something we've known since 2016. And we just live with it. We now know that every major privatization contract in Malta, it appears, was corruptly awarded. And it's something we push for every day. It's something we push for in the campaigning. It's what the foundation sets out to do every day. I don't know how to answer. You have to have hope. You have to believe that it is going to happen. The kind of responses we get range from something is happening, we just can't say what. The police will tell you, the magistrate's still working on it, we'll wait for them. But there is a really structural issue in Malta. The really key institutional bodies dedicated to fighting financial crime and corruption are at best extremely under-resourced and at worst full of people who really shouldn't be working there. And that also needs to change. But that rests with the executive branch. And for that, there needs to be a greater public push. Oh, sorry.
Should I?
Yes, please.
Yes, that's correct. It is a first step forward. I would say that EMFA is a much bigger step forward than what we achieved with the anti-SLAPP directive. Nobody enjoys full protection in this world. Nobody can be above law, or except some dictators who believe themselves to be above law. With how Article 4 looks like now, like I said, the set of safeguards for journalists and for their work is very powerful, and it is the maximum that we could have done. When I say maximum, I mean maximum. I mean go through it over and over and over again, because we've worked with everybody, including, first and foremost, I would say, with journalistic organizations and associations involved in this process for a long time. The maximum we could do with the legal basis that we have. And that's very important. Because, yes, national security is a sole prerogative of member states. It is not go to the treaties. I mean, we've looked everywhere. We know exactly the space of maneuver. This is something that stays in the member states. It doesn't mean that they could do anything anytime. We do have jurisprudence clearly stating that this is the case. We did not want a piece of legislation easily contestable and that could be attacked immediately to the European, to ECJ, to the European Court of Justice, because we've worked with those people defending this kind of legislation at the ECJ. So we were extremely careful, but also persistent, because to some point and I think some people here who are involved in the process and people coming from the journalistic associations, we also had this conversation, well, should we drop it? Have no Article 4 whatsoever? Or continue and try to improve these guarantees and make sure that every single word in there has legal soundness and can defend journalists if something happens.
Yes. I would like to react to comment on that too. We know we've worked hard in the Parliament for legislation, but also, as lawmakers, of course, we try to improve society by making laws. That's our primary role. But we also use our voices for those who do not have who cannot speak anymore for themselves, and for those that we promised that we would represent in this house and make their voice sound louder for justice. But next to that, I think in society we tend to believe that we can change everything by having the right laws. Actually, there were already good laws also in Malta that were not respected when the journalist was assassinated. There was a dictatorship in my home country before I came to Europe that were good laws, the separation of powers, the respect of freedom of speech, but it was not implemented. So right now in the EU, we have a lot of laws also against serious crime like drug trafficking. We've seen a journalist has been killed in the Netherlands as well. I think his name was De Vries, because he was investigating the drug dealers. You know, there are all these kind of issues. So what we can do, in my opinion, are minimum three things. First, we need to continue working on legislation. We need also, as citizens and as people, as lawmakers, to be critical readers. Because I am convinced that no journalist will die if everyone was just doing their job, if everyone else were doing their job. If we were tackling serious crime seriously, why would De Vries be in danger because he was investigating drugs? If everyone were doing their job as politicians, if when, I suppose, and I read that when Daphne Caruana Galizia was working, she was already threatened. The question is what happens before the journalist is killed. It's all the amount of people who do nothing before it happens. And this is continuing to be the same. If Norbert Zongo, my mentor, was killed, what I thought as a teenager there is that it was also my fault. It was all of us. We didn't do anything before he was killed. We read, we said he was right, we said he wrote great things, we loved what he was saying, but what did we do as citizens? And every day when I read the press in Flanders, in Belgium, in other European countries, whatever you see, what we need to wonder as citizens is what are we doing in our daily life? Do we have an opinion about all these things? Do we actually participate? Do we take the commitment to be responsible? The law alone will not protect the journalists. It is the quality of the democracy that we are living, and we have all the right to vote. Yeah, the women among us, thanks to the suffragettes, actually. But we all do have the right to vote, so we have a piece of power to shape this, the society that we want. So do we pay attention, and do we react when we need to react? I think that is just a common work to go towards justice at every level of society. And also among the press itself as well. There were very impressive journalists like Daphne Caruana Galizia, like Norbert Zongo, like many others. But within the press, the critical thinking and the seriousness of investigating crime should also remain in all editing rooms, because this is actually self-protection for the press to not make itself irrelevant. A lot of people are going to social media and to TikTok, I don't know if I can say this word here, to get news. A lot of teenagers, I would like them to read newspapers.
I'll second that, yes. And yeah, but a very clear point that it's not just about the laws, it's about enforcing them, and that's all of our responsibility. I'm really sorry, but we've reached 4 o'clock, and I think that is the end of our allotted time. Are there any final questions before we close the discussion? Yes, this lady in the third row.
Hi, Paul. My name is Elena Pereso, and I think rather than a question, out of respect for everyone's time, I want to say something to humanize your mother today. I met your mother only once in my life, and that was 30 years ago. I was a participant as a student in a simulation of the European Parliament. This was before Malta joining the EU. I read your book in Christmas. It's really important. I've told you privately that this is the book I want my son to read, to understand the Malta I love, the Malta I grew up in, and the Malta I will not return to. Your mother, and perhaps this aspect doesn't come out enough in your book, was very much a believer in something bigger than Malta, Europe, of how she campaigned for the referendum to join the European Union. And so it was very touching along the way, since her assassination, to see how you have turned Europe. And now I turn my gaze to the lawmakers in this room. I speak here as a private citizen. I'm a career EU official. Please continue your important work. You need to do more. And not just you, it's a collective effort, so this family receives the justice it deserves. Because that will be good for the family, for my country, Malta, and for the European Union. Thank you.
Well, thank you. That's a beautiful way to close this discussion. Thank you, Paul, for coming here and telling us about your fine book and your tribute to your mum. Thank you, Ramona, and thank you, Asita, for your contributions. And thank you to the audience for coming along today.